This is the Nighthawk on 680 CJOB.
Many of you would have caught at least part of the State of the Union address last night from U.S. President Barack Obama. Patrick Basham, our friend from the Democracy Institute in Washington, certainly saw all of it and has been pondering it since that time. This was it was an interesting speech, Patrick, in that despite the defeat that President Obama's party suffered in the recent midterms and the fact that he no longer controls either Congress or the Senate, it was a pretty defiant kind of stance for him to take, was it not?
It was. I think some people were surprised by the fact that President Obama was so partisan in his speech. Not partisan in the sense that he drew a lot of explicit contrast between Democrats and Republicans, but partisan in terms of the policy record that he discussed and the policy prescriptions that he put forward. Everyone in that room and a lot of people watching and listening elsewhere were, very, very aware that he was trumpeting things that Democrats alone support, that he was trashing things that Republicans alone support, and that he was making very, very clear that he would happily sign things that he agreed with and he would happily veto things that he disagreed with. And so the little bit of rhetoric about working together was just, drowned by all of the "I've done great, I'll continue to do great, just keep out of my way." And this is, I think, partly about reassuring the base of the Democratic Party, this sort of campaigning, populist, partisan style, reassure the base of the Democratic Party, the people who voted for him in 2008 and 2012, that they didn't waste their votes and that there is something to be proud of. But it's also, as these speeches always are, particularly in the second term, they're about legacy. So President Obama wants to get the first draft in before the historians do on what kind of a presidency he had. And he knows further to that if in 2016 a Democrat is elected to succeed him, that many, perhaps all of his quote-unquote major accomplishments will be set in stone, and that will enhance and consolidate his legacy. But if a Republican is elected and that Republican is brave enough or powerful enough to roll back, Obamacare and other things, then Obama's legacy will be watered down at best and quite significantly weakened, possibly.
You can understand that he does not want to be perceived, nor does any president want to be perceived as a lame duck for the last 2 years. He wants to be able to carry on his agenda.
Oh, absolutely. And, it shows, if you've got this kind of chutzpah, if you've got this kind of self-confidence or arrogance, however one wishes to characterize it, then you just simply ignore things that are inconvenient. You go back to the late 90s when Bill Clinton had to deliver one of these, not long after all of the Monica Lewinsky stuff was absolutely front page news. And a lot of people thought, how can he do this, given that personally and politically he's so embarrassed, compromised? But he went up there and he just did his Bill Clinton thing and just ignored the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room last night here in Washington was, of course, the fact that Republicans had a historic win in the midterm elections in November. And Obama was looking out literally over a sea of Republican faces, many of whom were not there just a few months ago. And he only praised himself for winning 2 presidential elections and didn't acknowledge in any sort of diplomatic, let alone generous way, the fact that the political environment and dynamic on Capitol Hill has changed quite dramatically. Now, the reason he didn't do that, first of all, I think he's just the kind of guy who sees himself as sort of should be at the top, is at the top, will always be at the top, and just doesn't feel there's a need to acknowledge failure. He's a very competitive guy as a person. And secondly, he and his advisors and the Democratic operatives, they think that the midterm election was not a fluke, but unrepresentative of what the country thinks. Because every time the Republicans say, as they have and they will continue to say, look, we won the election, you've got to recognize that most people are no longer in love with you. And the Obama folks turn around and say, oh, it was a midterm election that had, low turnout. Our voters, who showed up in droves to put him over the line against Romney in 2012, they didn't vote. So it's skewed. We don't take that as a fair reflection of what people think, so we're just going to continue on the way we were. So it's a completely different way of looking at the world and a way of looking at American politics and where voters are, where the people are today.
He did reference Keystone.
Yes, he did.
And it will not make Canadians any happier than they were the day before.
No, not at all. He took the opportunity to refer to the pipeline. Some of us thought beforehand that he probably would, because he is defiant and because he is self-confident, and remind folks of his recent announcement that if Keystone gets through the U.S. Congress, as it almost certainly will this time because the Republicans are now in charge in the Senate, that he would veto it. And this was his opportunity to remind folks of why he was right about the issue, and the Republicans, some Democrats, the unions, Bill Clinton, and Stephen Harper, and a lot of Canadians are wrong. But instead of attempting to present an argument and acknowledge that there is an argument on the other side as well, even if he thinks it's weaker than his, he simply, figuratively, gave Keystone the back of his hand. And in I think a sort of patronizing, condescending way, made offhand reference, implicit reference to this sort of minor issue that Republicans are so wound up about, that obviously someone in his position with his sophisticated mind knows is not, a front and center, not a front burner issue. I mean, it both reflects how he deals with these problems, and also I think it was a little adolescent in the sense that the Canadians just last week, announced unofficially because of his decision to veto Keystone that they weren't going to, play house at the forthcoming summit with the Americans. And so this is sort of a tit-for-tat thing that you really hope that the President of the United States doesn't engage in, especially in his State of the Union address, which is his one moment each year where he gets to play the statesman, to speak in the national interest. So apart from disagreeing with him on the Keystone issue itself, I thought it was just very disappointing the way he did that. And, I mean, it also speaks volumes in terms of his inability to get his arms around diplomacy. I mean, this is not the first time, but it's another example of how on this issue and some others, he seems to go out of his way to upset Canada. I mean, from an American or international point of view, Canada and Canadians are pretty hard to upset. So you've really got to do something very serious, and you've got to be incredibly unreasonable to get the Canadian political class, on your back, as it were, and to get people restless and upset with you on the other side of the border. And yet he's managed to do it. Completely unnecessary, I think unjustified, and as I say, just very underwhelming, very, very underwhelming in the President of the United States.
Have you ever come to any conclusions, Patrick, about why he has taken this kind of stance with Canada that he has over his 6 years?
You mean Keystone specifically, or just broadly?
It's just broadly, because that's the biggest issue, perhaps, but it's certainly not the only one, which is an irritant on this side of the border.
It's a couple of things. Probably the minor one is I don't think he's especially well versed in Canada. Now that doesn't make that's par for the course with American presidents. Some get up to speed, some don't. So despite the image as this incredible mind with this encyclopedic knowledge of everything, this is, I think, one of a number of areas where that doesn't apply. It isn't the case. But it's something else that, again, goes back to what I was touching on earlier about the type of person he is and how he views things in a political sense. And that is, we've got to remember that when he was running for president the first time in 2008, there was that fuss about whether, the Canadian consulate in Chicago was sort of feeding information that was unhelpful, basically criticizing Obama over trade issues and protectionism and this cross-border issues. It caused quite a temporary fuss, but quite a fuss in the campaign down here. And what his people concluded at the time, and they were public in the media in talking about this, in trying to bat this away, they were saying, look, the Canadian government isn't the Canadian government you think it is, because Americans always think of Canada as being, more to the left, more touchy-feely and all this kind of thing. They're not sympathetic to our guy. They don't want to see a Democrat get elected. They want to see a Republican. So this is a right-wing government in Canada that's trying to, upset the apple cart for Obama and, help the Republican, in that case McCain, get elected. That's the kind of thing, whether it's true or not, if you believe it to be true and you're one of these really hard-driven operators whose lifelong ambition is to be president or achieve some high office, you don't forget that. And so as much as he smiles and shakes hands with Stephen Harper for the photo ops, he's never forgotten, will never forget the fact in his mind that Stephen Harper's people tried to harm him when he first ran for president. And I think that colors everything. I'm not suggesting that the only reason he's vetoing Keystone is because of that, but it's always there in the background, and sometimes it comes to the foreground.
Yeah, but like most politicians, he doesn't forget a slight or a perceived slight, and so this carries on. Patrick, thanks so much for being with us again tonight.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thank you.
Patrick Basham is with the Democracy Institute in Washington. He joins us from time to time to talk international politics.